Okay, this is the 8th and last set of slides relating to research and your dissertation for the MBA. This one is about writing up your research. Now, the structure of your dissertation is ultimately down to you. More often than not, it has a common structure, which is an introduction, a literature review, methodology chapter, findings, analysis, discussion, and conclusions. You don't have to do that, but it's more common than not if you're doing primary research to actually go through that route to say how you've arrived at the situation where you want to investigate something, and which is your literature review, and then your research, how you're going to go about it. There's your chapter on your methodology, and finally how you deal with the data, the findings, the analysis, etc., etc. Now, the bit about writing up your research, which is the bit between where you're planning to do your work, where you actually do your work, and what you do with the data, all generally comes in the methodology chapter. With a dissertation, it's possible to have a different structure than the one I described. Once passed with distinction, a dissertation that had 2 chapters, and another time a dissertation had 3 chapters. Now, it may be that your work falls into those categories, but the most typical is to have an introductory chapter, which is actually telling us what you plan to do, how you're going to go about it, what you found, etc., and it acts as a route map. Literature review, what are the issues revolving around the issue you're investigating. Methodology, then on to findings, analysis, discussion, conclusions. Okay, so when you're writing up your research bit, which is, some people just say is the methodology chapter, you're actually dealing with 3 things. The methodology, which is got an ology on the end of it. In other words, why have you chosen to research in a particular way? Now, it could be that you decided you want to find out something by using quantitative analysis or quantitative data. Therefore, you have to explain why it is you chose that approach, what the benefits of that are going to be over and above doing a qualitative approach. Now, you don't have to write a textbook about research, okay? You just have to explain why you have chosen to behave in a certain way. You then describe and justify the methods which you have employed or will employ, and by the time you finish your dissertation, it's often in the past tense rather than in the future tense. When you're working and to start with, I intend to do this, later I did this, okay, and this is what happened. And then the third element is your data handling. How did you collect the data? How did you process it? How did you analyze it? Okay, so those 3 elements form the key issue of writing up your particular research, your bit of research. So now you've got to do the data presentation. What is it that you're going to be able to show from your data? It generally falls into findings chapter. Sometimes people want to do findings and analysis, they find it easier. I always get a bit confused when people are analysing before they've actually presented the data. So your data presentation has to be the key features, okay? If it's quantitative data, how did you handle it? What tests were employed? What is present in tables? Okay, or what can you present in tables? So your key features of data handling in quantitative data are those, okay? In qualitative inquiry, you are building understanding in depth. You've got lots of data, and the process was iterative. In other words, you made it up as you go along. It's an abuse of the word iterative, but I've got to try it anyway, okay? So in there, you've got to actually write up about how you reduced the data and coded it, what the relationship is between your data collection and analysis, and again, look at the chapter I wrote on qualitative inquiry or analysing qualitative data, because there is a relationship between data collection and subsequent analysis, what coding routines you employed, and what authenticity and trustworthiness you can show as a result. Now, if you're presenting tables and figures, they should be numbered according to the chapter. So if it's in chapter 3 and it's your first table, it's table 3.1, okay? And the same applies to figures. So always number the tables and figures according to the chapter. Okay. Don't repeat in the text what you've shown in a figure or table. Only amplify or explain for clarity. So don't write up everything you've shown in the text in a figure or table. Only do that if you need to clarify or explain anything. Okay. So here's an example of data presentation which doesn't need further justification in terms of text. This is what I did in terms of looking at the way in which replies came in across the system for things to do with certain aspects of head teacher induction. And you'll see that in the first year, this was data about what happened in the first year of taking up the headship. The percent of mentions, in other words, mentoring was mentioned by 40% of secondary head teachers. Nursery, 28%, 31% special, blah, blah, okay? And the next highest level was training in specific skill areas, peer group support, induction program, work shadowing, LEA support, reflection on practice, and specific training required or got undertaken during deputy headship. Okay, so what I've got there, you notice, is the percent of mentions. So of all the things they mentioned, 40% were about mentoring in secondary head teachers. Now, if I was going to be really picky about what I just said to you, I then add up that column and say, hang on, 40 plus 29, 69, 76, 85, 90, 96, 98.5. What happens to the 1.5%? Okay, now what I've done there is round up the figures. In other words, of all the things that are mentioned by secondary head teachers, those were the ones that had the biggest prominence. There were other things mentioned that didn't even rate as getting to be a percentage or a subset of a percentage. Okay, so the numbers were going down, don't always add up to 100, but the point is that these were the big areas. So that's one way of presenting data. You then got to put something in there about limitations. Okay, what are you not claiming? There's two aspects to that. Delimitations is you set out when you're designing your research what you're not going to deal with. That's what you call delimitations. You're not going to look at this, you're not going to look at that. You're going to only look at the following things, okay? But then your limitations about your outcomes are your findings in any way generalizable? A word or words that are used in qualitative data is transferability, relatability. Basically, have you got something where we can say we're reasonably definitive? It's going to be likely to be seen everywhere. That's generalizable. And if it isn't, then you qualify your findings accordingly and your analysis accordingly. You know, if you saw 10 people in a particular setting, there's no guarantee that another 10 people in a different setting or a similar setting elsewhere would feel the same way. So you saw what you saw at that space in that time. You'd also need to write out what problems emerged and what you'd do differently if you were to do the same in the future. Okay? And the final part of this section are what are the possibilities for future research. Now remember, this section, this series of slides is about writing up your research, not just writing up your dissertation, writing up your research. So in your limitations, what problems emerged? Would you do anything differently in the future? And what are the possibilities for future research? Now, everybody has possibilities for future research. So, we're reaching the end point, okay? And this is where your conclusions. And the question you must ask is, given the data, the conclusions I've drawn, are these the only ones I could have reached? And the chances are the answer is going to be no. And the example I often give when I'm talking about drawing conclusions is the process of gravity, the act of gravity. Doesn't seem to change very much, and you're pretty assured that if you drop something, it's going to go downwards. In other words, gravity affects a falling object, okay? So you're not going to spend too much time trying to argue against that. But most times, your conclusions are not the only conclusions that could have been reached from the data you've got. And if the answer therefore is no, then you need to explain why you chose that conclusion above all other possible conclusions. There may be good reason for that, okay? But you need to qualify your conclusions, not just say the conclusion I draw is therefore that's true. You need to say on what basis are there questions about your conclusions. So, we are now at the end of the 8th series of slides talking about dissertations and writing up your research. Hope you found that useful. You know to work now with your supervisor closely and to make sure that you keep in touch with them as much as possible, take their advice and guidance, okay?